Hello, and welcome back. Before we begin, I need to say something. 5,000 of you. 5,000 people choosing to spend their quiet hours here, in the dark, with these stories. I do not have the right words for that, so I will just say it plainly. Thank you. Not as a formality. As something I mean completely, in the way you mean something when you have sat alone for a long time making a thing and looked up to find that people were listening. You are why this exists, every one of you. Now, let us go somewhere. Think about the last thing you made with your hands, something physical, something that required the steadiness of a hand, the judgment of an eye, the accumulated knowledge of fingers that have done this before and remember how it goes, even when the mind is somewhere else. Think about what it felt like, the way the rest of the world goes quiet when you are working, the slow, satisfying accumulation of effort into form. Now think about what it would feel like to lose not the thing, but the ability to make, to have the hands and the knowledge and the tools and the craft of a lifetime, and to find one day that there is nothing left worth making. That the purpose the making served has been removed. That you are a craftsman in a world that no longer needs what you know how to build. Hold that feeling. It is the feeling that runs beneath every chapter of this story. The feeling that connects the young man in the workshop to the old man in the wheelchair. Everything Gehrman ever did was either an attempt to have it or a response to losing it. This is Gehrman, not the Gehrman you meet in The Hunter's Dream. The old man in the wheelchair, the gentle guide, the sad and patient presence at the centre of the night's most beautiful space. That Gehrman is the end of a very long story, and the end only makes sense when you know the beginning. Tonight we're going to know all of it, every chapter, every loss, every choice that could not be unmade, and everything built in the aftermath of choices that couldn't be. Settle in, let your body go heavy, and let me tell you everything about the man who built the hunt and what the hunt built of him in return. To understand Gehrman, you have to understand the city he came from, not the Yharnam of the Scourge, not the fog-wrapped, beast-haunted, blood-soaked nightmare that the game drops you into on the night of the hunt. The Yharnam before that. The city as it was when Gehrman was young, when the healing church was still building its reputation, and the blood ministration was still new enough to seem miraculous rather than monstrous. When the streets were full of the ordinary noise and movement of a city that believed it was on the right side of history. Yharnam, in those years, was a city of arrivals. People came from everywhere, from distant cities and isolated villages and places where the sick had nowhere else to go. They came along the roads that converged on the city's gates, carrying their illnesses and their desperation, and the particular hope of people who have heard that somewhere there is a place that can help. The healing church received them. The clinics opened. The blood ministration was administered by hands trained in the proper technique, in rooms designed to feel sacred by an institution that had built its entire public identity around the idea that what it was doing was a gift to humanity. The streets of Yharnam were full of pilgrims, the workshops were full of work, the grand cathedral was full of the faithful, and the faithful were full of the old blood, and the old blood was, for most people, for most of the early years, doing what it was supposed to do, healing, restoring, giving back to sick people the health that their illnesses had taken, in a quantity and with a reliability that no ordinary medicine could match. This is the Yharnam that Gehrman grew up in. Not naive. He was not naive, even young, and Yharnam was not a naive place, but functional. A city that had found a purpose and was pursuing it with the energy of an institution in its early years, when the successes still outnumber the failures, and the failures can still be explained away as exceptions. He was born into a family of craftspeople. The game does not tell us specifically what his family made. It tells us almost nothing about his origins before the workshop. But the craft tradition that he eventually mastered has the quality of something learned early, in a household where the making of things was the organizing principle of daily life. The patience, the attention to mechanism, the particular way that a skilled craftsman looks at an object, not just seeing its surface, but immediately, automatically, beginning to understand its structure, the decisions that produced its current form, the points where it could be improved. This is not something that develops in isolation. It develops in proximity to someone who already has it. He grew up watching someone make things, and then he started making things himself, and at some point, probably early, probably in the way that genuine talent always shows itself early, with the particular confidence of someone who has found the thing they are for, he became better at it than his teachers expected. Better than he was supposed to be at that age, with that much practice. The kind of better that announces itself not through boasting, but through the quality of the work, which is the only announcement that matters. By the time Gehrman came to the attention of the hunting tradition, he was already a craftsman of significant skill. Not a hunter, not yet, possibly never in the conventional sense of the word, but a maker, a person who understood the relationship between a tool and its purpose at a level that most people who use tools never reach, because most people who use tools are not also the people who think about what the tools should do and why. Yharnam, in those years, needed this. The beasts were coming, slowly at first at the edges of the districts, in the parts of the city where the oversight was thinnest, and the blood ministration had been administered longest and with the least monitoring. People were changing, not many, not yet, not in a way that the city as a whole was ready to acknowledge, but changing. And the people who went out at night to manage the consequences of the changing needed better tools than the ones they had. Gehrman saw this problem the way he saw every problem, as a design challenge, as a question with a right answer, or at least a better answer than the current one, that could be found through careful thought and careful making. He looked at the weapons that the early hunters were using, and he understood exactly what was wrong with them, and he went back to his workshop and he started trying to fix it. Before we follow Gehrman into the workshop and the weapons he built there, we need to spend some time with the idea at the centre of his craft. Because Gehrman was not simply a weaponsmith, he was a thinker. The weapons he made were the physical expression of a philosophy, a specific, coherent, deeply considered set of ideas about what hunting required and how tools should respond to those requirements, and understanding that philosophy is understanding him. The trick weapon is built around a single insight, that a tool designed to do only one thing is less useful than a tool designed to adapt. This sounds simple, it is not. Every weaponsmith who's ever lived has understood that different situations require different tools. The insight that made trick weapons possible was more specific than this. It was the understanding that the moment of transition between one tool, configuration and another is not just a logistical challenge to be minimized, but a tactical opportunity to be exploited. That the hunter who can change, mid-engagement, from one weapon configuration to another has an advantage that is not simply additive, not just the sum of what both configurations can do, but multiplicative. Because the change itself, the transformation that the opponent did not anticipate, is a weapon. Think about what a beast expects when it faces a hunter. It expects the weapon that the hunter is currently using. It orients to that weapon, adjusts its movement and its aggression to account for it, builds its engagement strategy around the threat profile that the current configuration presents, and then the hunter clicks the mechanism and the weapon transforms and the beast is suddenly facing something different, a different reach, a different weight distribution, a different attack angle, and in the gap between the beast's old expectation and its new reality, the hunter has a window. The trick weapon makes that gap. It manufactures the moment of confusion that every fighter tries to create, and that most weapons can only attempt through feint and misdirection. The trick weapon creates it mechanically, reliably, every time the mechanism is engaged, regardless of the hunter's skill at deception. Even an unskilled hunter can create a moment of opportunity with a well-made trick weapon. And a skilled hunter, one who has learned to time the transformation to the precise moment when the opportunity it creates will be most damaging, can do things with a trick weapon that are simply not possible with a conventional weapon of any kind. Gehrman understood this so completely that it changed the way he thought about everything. Not just weapons, everything. He became a person who looked for the transformation, for the mechanism that allowed a thing to change from one configuration to another, in every problem he encountered. Who thought about the moment of transition not as a vulnerability but as a resource? Who believed, as a foundational article of his philosophy, that the most dangerous thing in any situation is not the most powerful static element, but the most capable of adaptation. This philosophy showed up in his teaching. The hunters he trained were not the strongest hunters in Yharnam. Some of them were eventually, but strength was not what Gehrman selected for or cultivated. He trained adaptive hunters, hunters who could read a situation and change their approach mid-engagement, who were not committed to a single technique or a single attack pattern, who understood that the hunt was always asking new questions, and that the hunter who had only one answer would eventually encounter a question that answer could not address. This is what made his workshop different from the other craftsmen who were producing weapons for the hunt in the same period. The others built weapons. Good weapons, useful weapons, weapons that did what weapons were supposed to do. Gehrman built weapons that thought, weapons that encoded his philosophy, his belief in adaptation, in the tactical value of transformation, in the danger of commitment to a single form, directly into their mechanism. You could hold one of Gehrman's weapons and feel, in the way it balanced in your hand and the way the mechanism engaged, what he believed about hunting. That is not something most craftsmen achieve. The gap between a craftsman whose work is technically excellent and a craftsman whose work expresses a philosophy is the gap between a person who has mastered a tradition and a person who has understood it deeply enough to add something to it that was not there before. Gehrman added something. The trick weapons of the hunter's workshop are his contribution to Yharnam's history, and they are more than weapons. They are arguments, made in steel and leather and the precise tolerances of well-fitted mechanisms, but arguments nonetheless. The workshop that Gehrman established in Yharnam is the physical centre of everything that follows. Every other location in his story, Byrgenwerth, the Fishing Hamlet, the Clock Tower, the Hunter's Dream, is defined in relation to the workshop. It is the place he came from, the place he kept returning to, the place the dream was built to replicate because the dream needed something to anchor itself to, and the workshop was what Gehrman's mind supplied, when the moon presence reached into it, looking for the shape of home. The workshop was not large. Craftsmen's workshops rarely are. The scale of a craftsman's workspace is determined by the work, not by the ambitions of the craftsman, and the work that happened here was precise rather than massive. The tools were arranged with the particular intentionality of a person who thinks about arrangement. Everything in a place determined by the logic of use, by the question of what needed to be near what in the sequence of operations that building a trick weapon required. Anyone who walked in and paid attention would immediately understand that the person who arranged this space was someone who had spent a great deal of time thinking about how to work efficiently. The weapons on the shelves were in various stages of completion. This was constant. The workshop was always in progress, always in the middle of multiple projects at different stages, because Gehrman worked on several things simultaneously in the way that a mind comfortable with complexity maintains multiple threads without losing track of any of them. A mechanism waiting to be fitted, a blade waiting to be sharpened, a leather wrap waiting to be applied to a handle whose balance had been adjusted and needed to be tested again before the wrap went on, because the wrap would change the feel and the test needed to happen in the pre-wrap state to be useful. He worked in the early morning and late at night, and through the middle of the day when the light was good. He worked when he was thinking about something else, and the hands did what the hands knew how to do while the mind was elsewhere. He worked when hunters came to him with problems, not just problems of broken or inadequate weapons, but problems of technique, of approach, of the specific tactical situation they had encountered that their current equipment could not handle. And he worked on those problems out loud at the workbench, with the weapon in his hand and the hunter watching, so that the solution and the making of the solution happened together. This is a teaching method, not a formal one. Gehrman was not a formal teacher, did not develop curricula or organize lessons in the systematic way that the church's training programs eventually would. But every hunter who came to the workshop with a problem left with not just the weapon that addressed the problem, but with the understanding of why the weapon addressed it. Gehrman did not hand you a solution. He showed you the solution being made, which means he showed you the thinking that produced it, which means he gave you something more durable than the solution itself. He gave you the method. The hunters who trained with him were different from the hunters who came out of other traditions, not just more technically skilled, though they were. Different in the way they thought about the hunt, more patient, more adaptive, more willing to step back from an engagement that was not going well and reassess rather than committing to a failing approach out of stubbornness or fear. They thought like craftsmen. They approached the hunt the way Gehrman approached a design problem, methodically, with genuine curiosity about what the situation required, with the ability to hold a problem at a distance long enough to see it clearly before they started trying to solve it. There was a culture in the workshop, not an organised culture, not one with rules or ranks or the apparatus of institutional life, but a culture nonetheless, the shared set of assumptions and values that develops among people who spend a lot of time together doing serious work. The culture of the workshop said, the work matters more than the credit. The quality of the solution matters more than the speed of the solution. The hunter who comes to you with a problem is trusting you with something real, and you owe that trust the full attention of your best thinking. And the best weapon is not the most powerful weapon, it is the weapon that fits the hunter who will carry it. And fitting a hunter requires knowing the hunter, and knowing the hunter requires the kind of attention that most craftsmen do not consider part of their job. Gehrman considered it part of his job. He knew the hunters who came to him, not just their names and their weapon preferences, their fighting styles, their instincts, their tendencies under pressure, the particular ways that each of them was most likely to get into trouble in the field and what weapon configuration would give them the best chance of getting out of it. He held this knowledge the way a doctor holds knowledge of a patient, not as data but as a responsibility, as something entrusted to him that he was obligated to use well. The workshop was full of this kind of knowing, full of the weight of real relationships, the accumulated trust of years of people bringing their most serious problems to a place that took those problems seriously. And for a significant period, the years before the church's institutional ambitions reshaped the landscape of the hunt, it was the most important place in Yharnam for the people who went out at night to keep the city safe. It was full, it was alive, and Gehrman at the centre of it was doing the thing he was built to do, in the way he was built to do it, for people who needed it done. This was the happiest period of his life. Not because it was easy. It was not easy. None of it was easy. The hunt was brutal, and the scourge was growing, and the nights were long and dangerous, and the losses were real. But happy in the way that genuine purpose always produces happiness, regardless of the difficulty of the work. He knew why he was getting up in the morning. He knew what his hands were for. He knew that the thing he built every day in the workshop was something that mattered to real people, in real ways that he could see and verify and take satisfaction in. This happiness was the foundation of everything that was about to be built on top of it. And like all foundations, it becomes most visible in the story, not when it is present, but when it is gone. When the weight of everything that came after reveals in its absence exactly how much it was holding up. Gehrman's story does not exist in isolation from the scholarly tradition that was developing simultaneously at Byrgenwerth. The two worlds, the craftsman's workshop and the academic institution, overlapped in ways that were sometimes collaborative and sometimes deeply uncomfortable, and understanding Gehrman requires understanding the specific relationship he had with the people who were doing the other half of the work that the hunt depended on. Byrgenwerth was where the theoretical foundation of the hunt was built. Master Willem and his scholars were the people who studied the old blood, its properties, its origins, its relationship to the Thumerian civilization that had used it first, its connection to the Great Ones whose influence ran through it like a current through water. They were not hunters. They were not craftsmen. They were scholars. Thinkers who approached the old blood as a subject of intellectual inquiry, who wanted to understand it in the way that academics want to understand things, which is to say completely, at a level of depth that went far beyond what was necessary for practical application. Gehrman respected this, with reservations. The craftsman in him understood the value of deep understanding. You cannot make a good trick weapon without understanding the mechanics of both configurations and the transition between them, and this understanding requires the same kind of patient, systematic inquiry that Byrgenwerth applied to the old blood. But the craftsman in him also understood the danger of inquiry without application, of knowledge pursued for its own sake by people who are not thinking about what will happen when the knowledge is used. Theory without practice is incomplete, and the scholars of Byrgenwerth, for all their extraordinary intellectual gifts, were not people who went out at night to use what they understood. He knew Willem. The relationship between Gehrman and Byrgenwerth's master was not warm exactly. Willem was not a warm person, and Gehrman's directness did not naturally translate into the discursive, questioning mode of the academic relationship. But it was respectful. Willem saw in Gehrman's trick weapons the physical expression of an insight that resonated with his own philosophical concerns about the nature of transformation and the value of adaptive capacity. Gehrman saw in Willem's scholarship a rigour and an honesty that he did not always find in institutions, a genuine commitment to understanding over a commitment to conclusions that supported the institution's preferred narrative. He also saw, clearly and early, the danger in what Byrgenwerth was building. Not in the scholarship itself. The scholarship was sound. The inquiry was honest. The conclusions followed from the evidence with the integrity that genuine academic work requires. The danger was in Lawrence, in the student whose ambition was larger than his patience, in the person who had absorbed enough of Byrgenwerth's scholarship to understand the power of the old blood and enough of his own nature to decide that the careful, deliberate, step-by-step approach that Willem advocated was too slow. Lawrence left Byrgenwerth and founded the Healing Church. This is the event that divides Bloodborne's history into before and after, the single decision that sets every other event in motion. And Gehrman, who watched it happen from his workshop, understood what it meant before most people did. He understood because he was a craftsman, and craftsmen think about consequences. Every mechanism has failure modes. Every design choice that solves one problem creates new ones that the designer has to account for. A person who has spent their life thinking about how things break knows, when they see a new system being built, to ask immediately, how will this break? And Lawrence's system, the Healing Church, the blood ministration program, the industrial application of the old blood to the population of an entire city, had failure modes that Gehrman could see from the beginning. He did not stop it. This is one of the great silences at the centre of his story. The intervention he did not make, the warning he did not give loudly enough, the moment when the craftsman's knowledge of failure modes met the limits of the craftsman's authority in a world increasingly organised around institutional power. Gehrman could make weapons. He could train hunters. He could think, with extraordinary clarity, about the relationship between a tool and its purpose. He could not stop the Healing Church, so he watched it built, and he kept working, and he trained the people who would carry his weapons into the consequences of the institution he could not prevent. There was a period, not long in the scale of what came after, but significant, when the workshop and the Healing Church existed in something like partnership. The church needed hunters. Gehrman trained hunters. The arrangement was transactional but functional, and both sides understood the terms clearly enough to maintain it without too much friction. Ludwig changed the terms. Ludwig was a man of extraordinary conviction and extraordinary ambition, and the combination of these two qualities in a person with his gifts is both inspiring and dangerous. He believed that the hunt should be holy, not professional, not craft-based, not centred in the accumulated wisdom of a workshop tradition that had developed through decades of practical engagement with the realities of the scourge. Holy, organised around faith in the Healing Church's mission, motivated by a religious dedication to the idea that hunting beasts was a form of service to something sacred, structured around the institutional hierarchy of the church rather than around the organic relationships of the workshop. He was not wrong about everything. The hunt, as Yharnam's crisis deepened, needed to be larger than the workshop could make it. The number of beasts was growing faster than Gehrman's apprenticeship-based model could produce hunters to address them. Something more scalable was necessary. This is true, and Gehrman knew it, and the knowledge did not make watching Ludwig build what he built any less painful. He met Ludwig several times before the institution was fully established. The meetings were cordial in the surface way that meetings between people who respect each other's abilities and disagree about nearly everything tend to be cordial. A mutual acknowledgement of the other's competence, a careful navigation around the areas of deepest disagreement, a shared language of the hunt that allowed them to communicate without requiring them to resolve what they could not resolve. Ludwig admired Gehrman's weapons. He said so directly, in the way of a person who is honest about what is good, even when what is good belongs to someone whose approach he intends to supersede. He said the weapons were the finest in Yharnam. He said the hunters they produced were the most technically accomplished the city had. And then he said that technical accomplishment was not sufficient, that the hunt needed something the workshop could not provide, and that he intended to provide it. Gehrman listened. He asked questions, not the combative questions of a person defending their position, but the genuine questions of a craftsman trying to understand the full shape of what was being proposed, to see the failure modes before the design was committed to. He asked how Ludwig intended to maintain the standard of individual judgment that the hunt required when training hunters in cohorts rather than through individual apprenticeship. He asked what would happen when the church's institutional priorities and the specific demands of the hunt came into conflict, and who would decide which took precedence. He asked how the holy conviction that Ludwig wanted to build the hunt around would handle the nights, and there were always such nights, when the holy mission ran directly into circumstances that no amount of conviction could resolve, and only clear-headed pragmatic assessment would get a hunter home. Ludwig answered all of these questions. The answers were sincere and in several cases genuinely thoughtful, but they were the answers of a person who had not yet encountered the conditions he was designing for, who understood the hunt theoretically from the outside, rather than from the inside where the nights were actual nights, and the beasts were actual beasts, and the hunters who did not come home were actual people with actual histories and actual people who waited for them. Ludwig's answers were the answers of a man with a vision. Gehrman's questions were the questions of a man with scars. The conversation ended without resolution because it was not the kind of conversation that resolves. Ludwig built what he intended to build. Gehrman made what he intended to make, and the city got both. The institutional apparatus and the workshop tradition running in parallel, serving different hunters with different orientations, producing between them a hunting culture that was larger and more capable, and more philosophically divided than either of them alone would have created. Because what Ludwig built, the Healing Church Workshop, the Holy Blades, the systematic training program for hunters organised around the church's institutional hierarchy, was the workshop's philosophy stripped of its foundations. The trick weapons remained. The training methods remained. The physical vocabulary of the hunt that Gehrman had spent decades developing was incorporated wholesale into the church's new institution because it was good and it worked, and there was no reason to discard it. But the philosophy that the weapons expressed, the insistence on adaptation over commitment, on careful assessment over institutional loyalty, on the hunter's own judgment over the authority of an organisation that had interests beyond the safety of the people the hunt was supposed to protect, that was not incorporated. That did not survive the translation from workshop to institution, because institutions do not thrive on the kind of independent judgment that Gehrman's philosophy required. Institutions thrive on compliance, on the reliable execution of institutional directives by people who trust the institution's judgment over their own. The Holy Blades were good hunters. They were numerous and organised and motivated by a conviction that made them fight with a focus that individual hunters, working from craft alone, could not always match. They did the work. The city was safer for their existence than it would have been without them. but they were not what Gehrman had built. And as the years passed and Ludwig's institution grew, and the church's authority over the hunt became more complete, and the workshop's place in the hunting landscape became more peripheral, Gehrman experienced something that the weapons in his workshop had no mechanism for addressing. Not grief, exactly, though grief was part of it. Not anger. He was not a person who spent his energy on anger at things he could not change. Something quieter and more durable. The feeling of watching a thing you built be taken in a direction you did not intend. Watching the form persist after the meaning that gave the form its purpose has been extracted from it. The trick weapons in the church's workshops were still trick weapons. They still transformed. They still created the gap between one configuration and another that Gehrman had understood as the weapon's deepest tactical resource. But in the hands of hunters trained to obey institutional directives rather than their own judgment, the transformation was mechanical rather than philosophical. The weapon changed. The hunter did not think about what the change meant, what the moment of transition created, what the gap between the opponent's old expectation and their new reality made possible. They just used it, because that was what they had been trained to do. Gehrman watched this and felt the particular grief of the misunderstood teacher, not the grief of someone whose work has been rejected. That grief is sharp and clear, and in a strange way almost dignified, because rejection at least acknowledges what you made and chooses not to use it. The grief of the misunderstood teacher is quieter and more corrosive. It is the grief of watching your work used correctly on the surface in ways that produce the expected technical outcomes by people who have entirely missed the point of it, who are doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, or without reasons, or because they were told to rather than because they understood why. He kept working. This is what you need to understand about him. He always kept working. The loss of centrality did not stop the craft. The workshop was still there, and the work was still good. And the hunters who came to him rather than to the church's approved suppliers came because they trusted his craft above the institutional alternative, and that trust was not nothing. It was not what he had built, but it was not nothing. He kept working. And into the workshop, some years after Ludwig's institution had reshaped the landscape of the hunt, came Maria. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. If you have spent any time with Bloodborne's community, you have heard this name in the way that names attached to beloved things are always spoken, with a particular weight, a reverence that is not just about the character's power or beauty or narrative significance, but about something harder to name. The feeling that a character is completely realised, that there is no gap between who they are and how they are expressed, that the person the story shows you is a whole person, with interior depths that the story never fully reveals, because the person it is showing you would not reveal them either. Maria is this. She is the most fully realised character in Bloodborne's world, and she is fully realised specifically in the way she does not show herself, in the guard she keeps up, the things she does not say, the emotions that show in her fighting style, because her fighting style is the one place they cannot be entirely contained. She came from Cainhurst. This fact matters not because it defines her. It does not define her, she's far more than her origin, but because it explains the particular quality of her bearing, the way she carries herself, the formal, disciplined posture of someone raised in a culture that treated self-presentation as a moral category, that understood the way you held your body and conducted yourself in public as an expression of who you were. Cainhurst nobility did not slouch. Cainhurst nobility did not show weakness in front of people they were not sure they could trust. She came to Gehrman's workshop in the way that people come to the things that will change their lives, without fully understanding what they were walking toward, carrying only what they already were, which, in Maria's case, was considerable. The Velblood inheritance, the formal training of a Cainhurst fighter, the specific combination of grace and lethality that characterized the castle's finest, and something else, something harder to quantify but immediately apparent to anyone with the eyes to see it. Philosophical seriousness, an understanding that the hunt was not just a profession or a calling, but a moral practice, that the choice to pick up a weapon in service of a city required a corresponding commitment to thinking carefully about what the weapon was for and what you owed the people it was being used to protect. Gehrman saw this immediately. He saw it the way craftsmen see things, not as an impression or a feeling, but as something specific and legible, a quality of attention in the way she looked at the weapons on the wall that told him she was already trying to understand them, rather than simply sizing them up. Most people who came to the workshop looked at the weapons the way customers look at products, assessing their desirability, their aesthetic appeal, whether this one or that one seemed like something they could use. Maria looked at them the way Gehrman looked at them. She was already, before any teaching had happened, asking the question he always asked: what problem does this solve, and how does the design of it answer that question? He took her on. Not immediately. He was not a person who made important decisions quickly, and the decision to teach someone seriously was an important decision, because it meant investing in them the kind of attention that could not be given to everyone. He watched her first. He gave her tasks that were not yet teaching, things to do in the workshop that let him see how she worked, how she held the weapons, how she responded when something did not go the way she expected it to, whether she adjusted or whether she forced, whether she asked questions or assumed. She adjusted, she asked questions, and the questions were good ones. The kind of questions that arrive at the interesting part of a problem rather than the obvious part, that go past what is visible on the surface and toward what is happening underneath. This is the mark of a mind that is genuinely curious rather than just procedurally diligent, and genuine curiosity is the thing Gehrman had learned, over years of teaching, was the most reliable predictor of real mastery. He taught her everything. This is not an exaggeration. He taught her the weapons and the technique and the philosophy and the specific quality of attention that the hunt required, and she absorbed all of it and did something with it that he had not entirely anticipated. She made it her own. Not in the way of a student who adapts what they learn to their personal style, though she did that too, but in the deeper way of a student who takes the principle underneath the technique and applies it more broadly than the teacher thought to apply it, who finds implications in the philosophy that the philosopher himself had not followed to their conclusions. Her mastery of the rakuyo, the paired trick weapon that became her signature, expressed this perfectly. The rakuyo is two blades that function as one, a weapon that is already about partnership and complementarity, and the way that two things working together can do what neither could do alone. In Maria's hands, it expressed something additional, the idea that a weapon is an extension of judgment, that the choice of how and when to use each configuration is itself a moral choice, that the hunter who uses a weapon well is making constant small decisions about what the situation requires and what response is proportionate to it. She fought beautifully. This is the word people reach for, and it is the right word, not in the sense of aesthetically pleasing, though it was that too, but in the older sense. The sense in which a thing that is done with complete mastery and complete commitment to its own logic is beautiful regardless of what the thing is. Maria hunting was Maria being entirely herself, in the form that she was most entirely herself, and there is always beauty in that even when what is happening is violent. What grew between them was not simple. The game is careful about this. It does not tell us the exact nature of their relationship, the specific words that were said or not said, the precise emotional architecture of what existed between the craftsman and his student. But it tells us enough. It tells us that Gehrman built a doll in her likeness, that when the moon presence built the dream around him, it found the image of her in his mind and used it. That the plain doll, the gentle, patient, perpetually present figure who tends the dream's garden and cares for its hunters, is what Maria looked like through Gehrman's eyes. This is not the architecture of a relationship between a teacher and a student who drifted apart after the teaching was done. This is the architecture of a person who carried someone with him through centuries of impossibility, who found her face in the space his mind supplied when asked for the image of everything safe and worth returning to, who built a likeness of her not once but twice, once in the waking world, in the old abandoned workshop, and once in the dream, where the moon presence animated the likeness with something that was not her soul, but was its own real thing. He loved her. Whatever else is uncertain in this story, this is not. The nature of what she felt in return, whether it matched his, whether he ever knew. This the game leaves open, in the honest way that it leaves open the things that real life leaves open. People do not always love symmetrically. People do not always know whether what they feel is returned. Gehrman did not know, or knew imperfectly, and the uncertainty was part of what he carried. She was the best student he ever had. She became the best hunter the workshop ever produced, and she became, eventually, the specific shape of everything he could not keep. There is a village on a cliff above a dark sea. Small, always small, a fishing settlement of perhaps a few dozen families, people who organised their lives around the rhythms of the water, who knew the tides and the seasonal migrations of fish, and the particular signs in the sky and the sea that told them what the coming days would bring. They had been there for a very long time, longer than Yharnam had been a city, longer than the healing church had been an institution. They had been there long enough to know the sea well, long enough to know what lived in it. Kos lived in it, or near it, or through it. The Great One whose domain was the deep water, the entity that the village knew not as an abstraction or a subject of scholarly inquiry but as a presence. Something felt in the particular quality of certain mornings on the water, in the way the sea behaved in conditions that should have been dangerous but were not, in the stories passed from fishermen to their children that were not quite stories in the fictional sense but were not quite literal accounts either. Something between knowledge and myth, built up over generations of people living close to something vast and mostly benign. Kos had a child, an infant great one, left on the shore of the hamlet in circumstances the game does not fully clarify, born perhaps in the way that great ones produce offspring in ways that do not map onto human biological logic, or arrived on the shore through whatever mechanism connects the great one's native reality to the physical world. The village knew about the child. They tended it, or protected it, or simply accepted its presence on their shore with the pragmatic wisdom of people who have lived for generations near things they do not entirely understand, and have learned that understanding is not always necessary for coexistence. The scholars found it. The expedition to the fishing hamlet was not an accident. Byrgenwerth and the Healing Church's researchers had been aware of the hamlet for some time, aware that the village had a relationship with the old cosmos that was different from the scholarly relationship, that the people there had proximity to something significant without the conceptual framework that Byrgenwerth's training would have given them for understanding what it was. The expedition was organised, it was deliberate, and it included hunters, Maria among them, because the scholars did not go into the field without people capable of dealing with whatever the field presented. They found the infant on the shore, and they took it, not because it threatened them, not because it was causing harm or because its presence on the shore represented a danger that required intervention. They took it because it was there, and because it was a great one, or the child of a great one, and because the scholarly apparatus of Byrgenwerth and the Healing Church had been built entirely around the project of understanding and ultimately accessing the cosmic reality that great ones represented, and finding one small enough to be taken, in a location far enough from the Church's institutional scrutiny to allow the taking to happen without oversight, was the kind of opportunity that people who have spent their careers in pursuit of something do not walk away from. The scholars took the child, and then the hunters did what the institution decided was necessary to ensure the taking could not be witnessed, reported, challenged, or undone. They killed the villagers. Maria was there for this. Maria, who Gehrman had trained in a philosophy that was supposed to be about protecting people. Maria, who'd spent years in the workshop developing the judgment and the care and the commitment to thinking about what the weapon was for. Maria, who understood better than anyone except Gehrman himself what the hunt was supposed to mean. She was there, she had a weapon in her hands, and she used it. The game does not give us a clear account of what was in her mind in those moments. It does not have to. The aftermath tells us everything we need to know. What was in Maria's mind on the shore of the fishing hamlet, in the moments when the hunters were doing what the institution had decided needed to be done, was already the beginning of the thing that would eventually seal the clock tower and throw the Rakuyo into the well, and make her into the guardian of a passage she could not bring herself to let anyone use. She did it, and she came home, and the coming home was not the same as before. Gehrman saw it. He could not have seen it completely. He was not there, and she did not tell him what happened, and the institution had very strong reasons for ensuring that what happened at the fishing hamlet did not become common knowledge. But he was a person who knew Maria well, a person who had spent years learning to read hunters, their states, their conditions, the specific ways that the hunt's demands showed up in how they moved and how they held themselves, and how they sat at the workbench and looked at the weapons they had used. He could see that something was different. He could not, perhaps, have named exactly what had happened. But he could see that the person who came back from wherever Maria had been was carrying something that the workshop's philosophy had not prepared her to carry. She did not stay. This is the most significant thing about what happened after the fishing hamlet, not the specific sequence of events, not the exact timeline of her withdrawal from the hunt, but the fact that she left. That the hunter Gehrman had trained, the one who had absorbed his philosophy most completely, who had understood his teaching at the deepest level, who had made everything he built into something that was genuinely her own, looked at what the hunt had asked of her and decided she could not continue to be the thing that did that. She threw the Rakuyo into the well of the fishing hamlet, the paired blades that were the physical expression of everything Gehrman had taught her and everything she had become through that teaching. She threw them into the well of the village where she'd last used them for something she could not justify, and they sank, and she climbed to the clock tower, and she stopped. Not retired, stopped. There is a distinction that matters enormously here. Retirement is a choice made from completion. I have done what I came to do. I am laying this down because it is time. Stopping is a choice made from rupture. I cannot continue to be the thing that does this, because continuing to be that thing requires a self-conception that this act has made impossible for me to maintain. Maria stopped hunting because continuing to hunt required her to believe that what she did with weapons was justified, and the Fishing Hamlet had shown her something that could not be made consistent with that belief. She guarded the well instead. She placed herself at the passage between the waking world and the nightmare version of the hamlet, the nightmare that Koss's curse had created, where the hunters who participated in the massacre were held in permanent proximity to what they had done, and she made the passage difficult. She could not undo what had been done. She could not restore the dead. She could not give the child back. But she could stand between the well and anyone who would use it carelessly, and she could do that for as long as the nightmare held her, which turned out to be a very long time. Gehrman lost her before she was taken. This is the thing that the story keeps returning to, that the doll makes visible every time you look at it in the dream, that the loss was double. He lost the person Maria was before the Fishing Hamlet to the thing the Fishing Hamlet made of her, and then he lost what was left of her to the nightmare, and the version of her that the dream eventually replicated, the doll, the presence in the garden, the gentle patient figure who tends the flowers and cares for the hunters, is the version from before, the Maria of the workshop years, the student who asked good questions and fought beautifully and understood what he was actually teaching. The moon presence found that Maria when it built the dream around Gehrman, not the Maria of the clock tower, the Maria of the workshop, because that is where she lived in Gehrman's mind, not in the nightmare she ended up in, but in the years when the workshop was full, and the work was good, and the world made the kind of sense that allowed a person to believe they were doing the right thing. The doll is who Maria was before the hunt asked something of her that she could not give and remain herself. And Gehrman built the first version of the doll in the old abandoned workshop, the small room at the bottom of the shaft in the cathedral ward that most players never find, because the craftsman's response to the loss of a person is always, in the end, to build something that holds the shape of what was lost, to reach for the tools and the materials and the accumulated knowledge of a life spent making things and apply them, inadequately, heartbreakingly, to the problem of someone not being there anymore. He could not keep Maria, so he made a likeness. And the likeness sat in the workshop in the silence that followed her going, and looked like her without being her, and the nights in the workshop were very quiet. After Maria, after the Fishing Hamlet, after the shift in the workshop's place in the hunting landscape, after Ludwig's institution had reshaped the hunt into something that no longer centred what Gehrman had built, after all of it, the grief and the loss and the particular loneliness of a person who has outlasted the context that gave their life its meaning, something came for Gehrman. The game does not tell us the specifics of the encounter. It does not tell us where he was when it happened, or what form the approach took, or whether the moon presence announced itself clearly or arrived in the way that it apparently prefers to arrive, in the margin between waking and sleeping, in the quality of attention that becomes available in the deep part of the night when the usual structures of consciousness relax. What the game tells us, through the evidence of what resulted, is the shape of the bargain. The moon presence offered Gehrman the dream, and Gehrman accepted. To understand why he accepted, you have to understand where he was at that moment. Not geographically, emotionally, spiritually in the non-religious sense of that word, the sense that describes the state of a person's interior life, the degree to which the conditions of their life allow them to feel that they are where they are supposed to be, doing what they are supposed to be doing. Gehrman was lost, not dramatically, not in the way of a person who has suffered a singular devastating blow and is visibly broken by it. Lost in the quieter, more durable way of a person whose sense of purpose has been eroded gradually over years by a series of losses that individually were bearable and cumulatively were not. The workshop was still there, the weapons were still being made, the hunters who came to him were still being trained and equipped and sent back out. But the centre of gravity was gone. The thing that made all of it feel essential rather than merely functional was gone. Maria was gone. The philosophical heart of what he had built, the insistence on careful judgment, on the hunter's independent assessment of what the situation required, on the primacy of the people the hunt was supposed to protect over the institutional interests of the organisations that administered it, that was being systematically sidelined by the healing church's growing authority over the hunt. He was a craftsman without a purpose that felt sufficient to the craft, a teacher whose best student was gone and whose teaching tradition was being absorbed into an institution whose values he did not share. A person who had loved someone and built a likeness of her, because the real thing was gone, and the likeness was the best available substitute, and the substitute was not enough, but it was what he had. The moon presence looked at this. Whatever the moon presence is, the game is deliberately unclear about its nature, its origins, its relationship to the other great ones, its specific agenda in Yharnam. It clearly has the ability to perceive the interior states of the people it approaches with a precision that is either supernatural insight or the long practice of an entity that has been studying human beings for longer than human civilization has existed. It looked at Gehrman and it saw exactly what he needed, and it offered it to him in a form he could not refuse. The dream, a place built from his workshop, the physical space of his greatest purpose, replicated and preserved and made permanent. The tools, the workbench, the weapons on the shelves, the particular organisation of a craftsman's space that expressed in every detail how he thought and what he valued. And the doll, the moon presence found the doll in the workshop, or the doll in his mind, the likeness of Maria that he had built because he could not keep the real thing, and it animated it, gave it something. Not Maria's soul. Maria's soul was not available, was somewhere in the nightmare, was wherever the person Maria had been went when the person Maria had become stopped being able to maintain herself. But something, a presence, gentle and patient, that would inhabit the shape and tend the garden and care for the hunters who passed through, and be, in the dream's permanent moonlit space, a warmth that the workshop had not had since Maria left, and purpose. The dream would be the centre of the hunt, not the church's hunt, not Ludwig's institutional apparatus, but the original hunt, the hunt as Gehrman understood it, managed by Gehrman from the workshop, with the weapons and the philosophy and the craftsman's care that had always been the foundation of what he built. The hunters who came through the dream's lanterns would be his hunters. He would equip them and guide them and send them back out with the full investment of everything he knew. This was the offer, and the cost, the binding to the dream, the inability to leave, the continuation that was not the same as living because it could not end, was stated clearly enough in the terms of the offer that Gehrman cannot be said to have been deceived. He understood what he was accepting. Not fully. No one understands fully in the moment of a bargain what the full weight of the cost will feel like after centuries of carrying it. But clearly enough, the dream was not freedom. He knew this. He chose it anyway. Why does a person choose a beautiful prison over an empty freedom? Because the prison contains something that the freedom does not. Because the freedom is a freedom to grieve, and the prison is a place of purpose. And at that specific moment, in that specific state of accumulated loss, purpose felt more survivable than grief. He said yes, and the dream closed around him, and the moon presence, satisfied with the arrangement, withdrew to the position it maintains throughout Bloodborne's story. Present everywhere, visible nowhere, watching from the dark side of the moon it names itself for. The dream opened, the lanterns lit, and Gehrman, who had spent his life making things that could transform, click, unfold, shift from one form into another, found himself in a configuration from which no transformation was available. He was the first hunter, the permanent guide, the craftsman in his workshop at the centre of the night, waiting for the hunters to come through. And they came. The early years of the dream were, in a specific and complicated sense, good. Not good in the way that the workshop years had been good. The dream was always a prison, and Gehrman always knew it, and the knowledge never entirely left the air of the place regardless of what else was in it. But good in the way that having a purpose is always good, even in constrained conditions. The hunters came. They arrived in the dream disoriented and wounded, and in need of what the workshop offered. And Gehrman gave it to them. The weapons, the guidance, the specific and honest assessment of what they were facing and what they needed to face it. He was, in these early years, the best version of the guide the dream required. Not because he was performing the role, but because the role was genuinely aligned with what he had always been. He had always been a teacher. He had always equipped hunters and sent them into the field with the full investment of everything he knew and cared genuinely about whether they came back. The dream formalized and extended this, gave it a structure and a scale and a permanence that the workshop had not had. But the thing itself, the caring, was not manufactured. It was already there. It was the deepest thing about him. The hunters who came through in these early decades were, in many cases, extraordinary. The dream attracted a particular kind of hunter. People who found the lanterns in the moments when the night was worst, who had pushed past the ordinary limits of what hunters were expected to survive, and found themselves in the dream as a result. They were not always the strongest hunters. They were the most persistent, the most committed, the ones who kept getting up. Gehrman recognized them. He had a specific quality of recognition for the hunters who would matter, who would go deep enough into the hunt to change something, to reach the places where the night's real answers were, to encounter the cosmic reality underlying Yharnam's surface horror and come back from it changed rather than destroyed. He could see it early. He did not always say so. He did not offer flattery or premature encouragement, because flattery was not honest and premature encouragement was not kind, because the hunt was too serious for either. But he saw it, and he sent them back out, equipped, advised, pointed toward what needed to be done, and then he waited. The waiting was the hardest part. It always had been. Even in the workshop years before the dream, the period between sending a hunter out and hearing how they fared was a period of genuine uncertainty, because the hunt was genuinely dangerous and the weapons he built were good but not infallible, and the hunters he trained were skilled, but not invincible. In the dream, the waiting was intensified. He could not go and see. He could not check. He could not even receive news through the ordinary channels that the waking world provided, because the dream was not connected to the waking world's information infrastructure. He knew what hunters told him when they came back. He inferred the rest from the pattern of who came back and who did not. The ones who did not come back, these are the losses that compound without resolution. In the waking world, loss is processed through the mechanisms that human social life provides for it. The acknowledgement of others who share the grief, the rituals of mourning, the passage of time that does its softening work whether you want it to or not. In the dream, none of these mechanisms applied. The hunter did not return. That was the fact, bare and unprocessed, added to all the previous bare unprocessed facts of the ones who had not returned before. There was no funeral. There was no mourning community. There was the garden, and the workshop, and the doll and the moon, and there was Gehrman, and he felt each loss with the full weight that loss deserves, and the dream did not provide any of the ordinary buffers that make loss bearable for ordinary people living ordinary lives. He kept caring anyway. This is the thing that I want you to hold on to about Gehrman in the dream. Not the imprisonment, not the sadness, not the wheelchair or the centuries or the complicated deal he made with the moon presence. The fact that he kept caring, that he chose continuously across years and then decades and then centuries of accumulated loss to keep investing in the hunters who came to him, to keep asking how the hunt went and meaning the question, to keep sending people out with genuine hope rather than the performance of hope that would have been so much easier to maintain. He could have stopped, not stopped existing. The dream would not allow that, but stopped caring in any real sense. Let the role become purely mechanical, guide the hunters through the necessary orientation, and equip them, and point them toward the door without the genuine engagement that made the guidance valuable. No one would have known. The moon presence presumably did not require that he care. It required that he function, that the dream's operational purpose be maintained. The caring was his own choice, made against the incentives that centuries of loss create in a person who cannot escape the consequences of caring. There were nights, or what passed for nights, in the dream's perpetual moonlit space, where the distinction between night and day had no practical meaning, when the weight of the accumulated loss became very heavy. When Gehrman sat in his chair at the edge of the garden and looked at the moon that was not quite the right moon, and thought about the ones who had not come back. Not just recently, all of them. The full register, stretching back through the centuries, of the hunters whose names he still remembered, and the ones whose names had blurred at the edges, from the sheer volume of the list, but whose faces he sometimes still saw with the arbitrary, uncontrollable clarity of a mind that retains what it retains regardless of what you would prefer it to release. He thought about the early hunters, the ones from the first decades of the dream, when the scourge was newer and the city was not yet as broken, and the hunts were desperate in the way that things are desperate when they are new, rather than in the way that things are desperate when they have been going on long enough to feel inevitable. Those hunters had names he remembered completely, details, the specific way one of them held her weapon when she was tired, a slight drop in the left shoulder that he had corrected 3 times before she finally corrected it herself, the way another always came back to the dream before he was ready to go back out, not wounded enough to need the extended rest but needing the workshop's particular quality of presence, the tools on the shelves and the doll in the garden, and Gehrman himself in his chair, representing the normalcy of the hunt, the ongoing functional reality of it, in a way that he seemed to need confirmed before he could continue. Gehrman had given him that, had sat with him without commentary, without the suggestion that he should go sooner, letting the time be what it needed to be. That hunter had not come back eventually. He had gone out one night and not returned, and Gehrman had waited through the particular quality of waiting that becomes, at a certain point, something else. Not waiting for someone who is late, but sitting with the knowledge that the lateness has become permanent, that the quality of attention you are directing toward the door is no longer anticipation, but grief. Doing the only thing grief knows how to do in the absence of ceremony, which is simply stay. He stayed. Through all of them, for all of them. He was the one constant in the dream, the thing that was there when the hunters arrived, and still there when they did not come back, the witness to the full scope of what the hunt cost, the keeper of the record that no institutional document would ever contain because the institutions did not track what the individual hunters felt and needed and lost. Gehrman tracked this, not consciously, not in any formal sense. There were no ledgers in the workshop's drawers, no written account of each hunter who had passed through, but he carried it, in the specific weight of the centuries, in the particular quality of his eyes when a new hunter arrived and he looked at them and thought simultaneously about who they were and who all the others had been. He kept caring, and the hunters who came through the dream received that care and took it with them into the waking world, and some of them came back and some of them did not, and Gehrman tended his garden and waited and kept caring regardless. At some point, the body changed. The dream preserves life. It does not preserve wholeness. Whatever happened to Gehrman's legs, an old injury perhaps, from the years when he still went out himself, from the first hunts before the dream, when the craftsman who built the weapons also carried them. The dream kept the consequence rather than healing it. He was alive, he was present, he was in his workshop with his tools and his doll and his garden. And he could not walk. The wheelchair is the most important visual fact about Gehrman. More than the age in his face, more than the white of his hair, more than the specific quality of his eyes when he looks at you. The wheelchair tells the story in a single image. This is a person who cannot go where he would go, who knows the way, who has known the way for longer than most people who walk freely have been alive and cannot take it, who sits at the centre of the dream's beautiful space and watches every hunter who comes through do the thing he cannot do, which is leave. Think about what that costs. Think about it not as a fact about a fictional character, but as an experience. You have the knowledge, you have the weapons, you have the craft and the wisdom and the century-deep understanding of what the hunt requires and how to survive it. You can look at a hunter who has just arrived in your workshop and see, with a precision that comes from having looked at thousands of hunters, exactly what they need and what they should do and where the night's real questions are waiting for them. You can give them all of this, and then you watch them go. Every single time you watch them go. Through the door of the workshop and down the path to the lanterns and back into the waking world that you can no longer reach. Every single time they go and you stay. The garden is still there. The moon is still there. The doll moves quietly through the flowers with the patient attention of something that finds meaning in the tending. And Gehrman is in his chair at the centre of it, and the world beyond the dream's boundaries is a place he knows exists and cannot visit. He asked the hunters about it. This is not recorded anywhere in the game's dialogue. It is implied rather than stated, the way most of the truest things about Gehrman are implied rather than stated. but you can feel it in the quality of his interest when hunters return, in the way he listens. He asked about the streets, whether the fog was thick along the river road, whether the gas lamps were still burning in such and such a district, whether the cobblestones near the cathedral ward entrance were still slick from where the rain collected in the low spots. Details that would be meaningless to anyone who did not know those streets intimately and miss them with the specific physical longing of someone who cannot return to a place they know by heart. He had memorized Yharnam. He had known it the way a person knows a city they grew up in their feet, in the automatic knowledge of turns and distances that allows you to navigate without thinking, in the way the light falls at certain hours on certain surfaces, in a way that is particular to that place and no other. And the dream had taken him out of the city while leaving him in possession of all of that knowledge, so that he carried Yharnam in his body, in the muscle memory and the spatial sense and the smells and sounds that the mind retains long after the occasion of their learning, in a body that could no longer go back to the place that had made those impressions. The wheelchair, in this context, is not just a symbol of physical limitation. It is the physical expression of a specific kind of grief, the grief of a person who is still fully present to what they have lost, who has not been allowed the merciful dulling that time and distance and the ordinary work of moving on would provide, who lives in the perpetual immediacy of knowing exactly what they cannot reach. He sat in it and tended his garden and guided his hunters and waited, with the infinite patience of someone who has learned that there is nothing to do but wait, for the hunter who would be strong enough to end the waiting. Gehrman wanted to die. This is not a tragedy in the way that it would be a tragedy in an ordinary story. In the context of what the dream had made of him, the centuries of continuation without the possibility of conclusion, the accumulation of losses that could not be processed through the ordinary mechanisms of a human life, the imprisonment in beauty that remained beautiful but had long since stopped being enough. The desire for death is the most sane and most human thing about him. He was not built for immortality. No one is. The human animal is built for a life that ends, and the ending is not a failure of the design, but a feature of it. The thing that gives the life its shape, that makes the choices and the relationships and the work matter in the specific way that they matter to finite creatures. Gehrman had been denied this, not cruelly, not vindictively. The moon presence does not appear to take pleasure in his suffering. The denial is simply a consequence of what the dream requires. The dream needs a dreamer, and the dreamer must persist, and so Gehrman persists. But the persisting was never the point for him. The point was always the work, the people, the making and the teaching and the caring. And those things, which are finite things, things that matter in the context of a finite life, had become strange and heavy in the context of continuation that never resolved. The dream had given him everything it promised. The workshop was there, the tools were there, the doll was there, gentle and patient and present in exactly the way he had needed her to be in the first centuries, when the grief of Maria's loss was still raw, and the doll's presence was a comfort that he could not have articulated as comfort, but felt nonetheless. The purpose was there. The hunters came and needed what he had, and he gave it, and the cycle repeated with the regularity of a mechanism designed to run indefinitely. And indefinitely was the problem. The mechanism ran and produced no conclusion. The hunters arrived and were guided and departed and sometimes returned and sometimes did not, and then more hunters arrived, and the mechanism ran. He could not see from inside it whether it was moving toward anything, whether all of this, the weapons and the guidance and the centuries of caring and the accumulated weight of everyone who had come through and been sent back out, was building toward a destination, or simply spinning in place, producing the same outputs from the same inputs in the same cycle, without any movement towards something that could be called an end. He had been a craftsman. Craftsmen build things with destinations. So a trick weapon has a configuration for each situation, a beginning state and a transformed state, and the mechanism that moves between them, and the whole thing exists in service of a purpose that is legible from the design. A weapon without a purpose is not a weapon. It is a collection of mechanisms in a shape that has forgotten what it is for. Gehrman, in the centuries of the dream, had not forgotten what he was for, but he had begun to wonder whether being for something indefinitely, without resolution, without the ending that gives the purpose its full meaning, was still the same as purpose, or whether it had become something else, something that resembled purpose from the outside and felt hollow from the inside, the way anything that continues past the point of its natural conclusion eventually becomes hollow. He could not ask for death directly. The moon presence was watching. The dream was the moon presence's construct, and Gehrman understood, at whatever level the dream allowed him to understand things about his own situation, that asking explicitly for the termination of the arrangement was not something the terms permitted. But he could, and did, try to give hunters the tools and the knowledge they needed to become capable of ending the arrangement on his behalf. This is the thing about Gehrman's guidance that changes when you understand it fully. Every piece of advice he gave, every weapon he offered, every careful and honest assessment of what the hunt required and where the knight's real questions were, all of it was simultaneously in service of the hunt and in service of his own eventual liberation. Not dishonestly, not with the calculated manipulation of a person using others for their own ends, but with the layered intention of someone who understands that the thing that would free them is also the thing that would complete the hunt's purpose, and that therefore guiding hunters toward completion is the same act as guiding them toward his freedom. The hunter, capable of ending the dream, was the hunter capable of completing what the night was actually about. The two were the same. Gehrman was not using his hunters. He was, in the truest sense of what the hunt had always been supposed to be, guiding them toward the thing the hunt was for, and the thing the hunt was for, fully accomplished, would also be the thing that ended his imprisonment. He trained every hunter with this in mind. Most of them were not capable of it. Most of them were good hunters, skilled and dedicated and valuable to the city's survival, but not the specific kind of hunter capable of standing against Gehrman himself, and then, potentially, against what waited behind him. The ones who were not capable, he guided toward what they could do, and sent out, and hoped for, and grieved when they did not come back. And he waited for the one who would be different, with the patience of a craftsman who knows what they are building and is willing to wait as long as the building takes, with the specific quality of attention he brought to every new arrival, looking for the thing that would distinguish this hunter from the ones before, the quality of persistence and adaptability and philosophical seriousness that marked the hunter who would go all the way to the night's deepest chapter. He had been waiting for a long time. He would wait as long as it took, and while he waited he tended his garden and guided his hunters and sat in his chair at the centre of the moonlit space with the patience of a person who has run out of things to do except wait, and has made a kind of peace with the waiting. The kind of peace that is not contentment, but is something more durable. The settled, quiet, undemanding acceptance of a situation that cannot be changed and therefore is not worth spending energy resisting. He accepted it, and he waited. And one night, through the lanterns, you arrived. And then there was you. The game does not tell us what Gehrman sees when you first arrive in the dream. It shows us what he does, the gentle orientation, the practical guidance, the weapons offered with the same care that every hunter received. But the specific quality of his attention in those first moments, the way he looks at the hunter standing in his workshop for the first time, this is something the game conveys not through dialogue but through the accumulated weight of everything you have come to understand about him by the time you reach the end. He saw something. He did not say so. He never said so. Through the whole night, through all the returns and the departures and the accumulation of echoes that marked your passage through Yharnam, he guided you the way he guided everyone. Practically, honestly, without flattery or premature confidence. He told you what the hunt required. He told you where to go and what you were facing and what would help. He told you the truth, which is what he always told, but he watched you differently. He watched you the way he had watched a handful of hunters across the centuries, with a specific quality of attention that was not just professional assessment, but something closer to hope. Not hope of the desperate, wishful kind, hope of the careful, considered kind, the kind that a craftsman develops over a lifetime of building, things that are supposed to work. A conditional hope, a hope contingent on the evidence, a hope that adjusts itself to what the evidence shows and does not commit more than the evidence warrants. You came back. You always came back, through every death and every return, through all the nights that should have ended you and did not, through the accumulating insight that changed how you saw the world and what you could do in it. You came back to the dream and received what it offered and went back out, and the pattern of your returns told Gehrman something that the pattern of most hunters' returns did not tell him. He tended his garden. He sat in his chair at the centre of the moonlit space, and he watched you go and waited for you to return, and said what needed to be said when you came back, and said what needed to be said when you went out again. And in the spaces between, in the quiet hours of the dream when the workshop was empty, and the doll moved through the flowers and the moon held its position in the impossible sky, he thought about what was coming, about what the night was building toward, about whether you were the hunter he had been preparing for. The night reaches its conclusion. Whatever path the hunt has taken you down, whether you have found the umbilical cords or not, whether you have gathered the insight that unlocks the night's deepest chapter, or arrived at its ending through the accumulation of ordinary hunting achievement, you come back to the dream for the last time, and Gehrman is there, and what happens next depends on what you choose. These are not simply different endings. They are different truths about what the story was. They do not contradict each other. Bloodborne is not a story where only one ending is real and the others are mistakes. They are different possible completions of the same story, each one revealing something true about what the story contains, each one asking you to sit with a different aspect of what it means to have travelled this far. The first ending. You kneel. Gehrman asks you to submit, to let him grant you the mercy he offers every hunter, the release from the dream before the dream's logic claims you fully, and you accept. He stands. The man who cannot walk, rising from the wheelchair in the moment that the dream requires it of him. This is worth pausing on. The dream that has confined him to the chair does not prevent him from standing when the purpose requires it. The confinement is not complete. The dream preserves enough of him to do what needs to be done, and what needs to be done in this moment is the last kind act he has available. His scythe comes out. The weapon is enormous and elegant and devastating, and he uses it with the economy of a craftsman who has built weapons his entire life and understands, at a cellular level, how to use what he has made. He ends you in the garden with the same practiced efficiency of a person performing a familiar task, and then he returns to his chair. Watch him in this ending. Watch what happens after. He returns to his chair and he says something quietly, words directed at no one, or at the garden, or at the space where you were a moment ago. He says Lawrence. He says Master Willem. He is not in the dream anymore, not entirely. He's somewhere earlier. The workshop, maybe. The years before the dream, before the nightmare, before all of it. He is in the place his mind goes when the task is done and the guard comes down and there is nothing left to maintain the present against the weight of everything that came before. This ending is the system continuing. The moon presence receives what it requires. The hunt goes on. The dream persists. Gehrman returns to waiting for the next hunter and the next. The mercy he offered you was real. The alternative, becoming what he has become, is not something he would wish on anyone. But the mercy is also the preservation of the arrangement. The moon presence is satisfied. Nothing changes. Gehrman stays. The second ending. You refuse to kneel. You fight him. And here is where the game shows you, in the most direct possible way, who Gehrman was before the dream made him the gentle figure in the wheelchair. He fights with the full mastery of a craftsman who has spent a century developing the weapons he carries, and several more centuries in a space that gives him nothing to do but think about how to use them. He is fast. He is precise. He is devastating in the way that a person is devastating when they are both fully skilled and fully committed, when there is no reservation in the technique, when the thing they are doing is the thing they are most capable of doing. He fights beautifully. This is the word again, and it is still right. Not in spite of the violence, but through it, through the complete expression of a lifetime of craft applied fully, without holding back, to the problem in front of him. He fights the way his best students fought. He fights the way Maria fought. He fights like the first hunter, which is what he is. Underneath the chair and the centuries and the gentle guidance, the person who built the weapons and the philosophy and the hunt itself, still present, still capable, still entirely himself when the situation calls for it. You defeat him. He falls in the garden, among the flowers he has tended for centuries, in the space that was built from his grief and his love and the specific quality of what he had lost. And the moon presence descends, because the dream without a dreamer is a dream without a function, and the moon presence requires the function. It comes for you. It intends to make you what Gehrman was. But Gehrman is free. He lies in the flowers, and the dream is ending or changing or transitioning into its next configuration, and he is dying in the way that the dream would not allow, in the way that the centuries of continuation had made impossible, in the way that he has been waiting for across the full span of everything we have followed him through tonight. The ending that the dream denied him is happening. He is going wherever craftsmen go, wherever the people go who spent their lives making things and caring about the people who used them, and losing what they loved and making likenesses of what they lost, and saying yes to bargains in the dark because the alternative was emptiness. He is going there. Finally, after all of it. Look at his face. The game gives you a moment in the seconds before the moon. Presence claims your attention, to see him there in the flowers, and what you see is not anguish. It is something that resembles more than anything else the expression of a person who has just been allowed to put down something very heavy that they have been carrying for a very long time. Relief. After centuries, relief. But you take his place. The moon presence claims you as it claimed him, and the dream continues, and what has changed is only who is trapped inside it. Gehrman's liberation is real. Your binding is also real. The second ending is the ending of freedom exchanged. His freedom purchased with yours, the cycle preserved even as the dreamer changes. The moon presence is satisfied. The dream persists. Different prisoner, same prison. The third ending. You have done something different. You found the umbilical cords, the remnants of the Great One's impossible births, scattered across Yharnam's most hidden corners, in the nightmare and the research hall and the places where the cosmic and the human have been closest for longest. You consumed them. You carried inside you through the whole night the accumulated proximity to the Great One's reality that the cords represent, and it changed something fundamental about what you're capable of perceiving and withstanding. You fight Gehrman. You defeat him. The moon presence descends and you do not kneel. You fight that too, and you defeat it. What comes next is the most extraordinary and the most difficult thing Bloodborne asks you to sit with. The infant that the plain doll holds in the aftermath, small, strange, luminous with something that is not quite light, is you, or is what you have become. The childhood's beginning that the ending is named for is not a return to something earlier. It is the beginning of the next thing, the thing that the healing church was always reaching toward, that Byrgenwerth was always trying to understand, that the choir was trying to force open with their experiments in the upper cathedral ward. A human being becoming something that is no longer entirely human, through the accumulation of insight rather than the injection of blood. You ascended. You became what the Great Ones are. Gehrman's liberation, in this ending, is complete. The moon presence is defeated. The dream, without either its original dreamer or the entity that sustained it, presumably closes. The garden empties. The flowers remain, perhaps, in whatever state things in the dream remain when the dream ends. And Gehrman is free in the fullest sense, not liberated into a new binding, not replaced by a new dreamer, free into the ending that the dream spent centuries denying him. His story is the scaffolding of this ending, the workshop that trained the hunters, the weapons that carried the philosophy, the doll that carried the warmth, the centuries of guidance that built toward the possibility of a hunter capable of reaching this conclusion. All of it was necessary. All of it was the structure within which the third ending became possible. He is the foundation, not the achievement. And the foundation is what the building stands on, and without the foundation the building does not exist. And the building, the extraordinary thing the third ending accomplishes, is built on everything Gehrman did across the full length of his impossible life. He built a hunt. The hunt produced a god. The god is free. The craftsman is free. This is the ending that costs the most to reach and gives back the most when you do. The ending where the long night is finally, completely, entirely over, not just for you, for him, for the city, for the dream, for the moon presence that thought it had found a permanent arrangement and discovered, in the moment of your ascension, that it had not accounted for what the right hunter, at the right moment, with the right accumulation of insight and the right weapons. Weapons built by a craftsman who believed in adaptation, in the value of transformation, in the tactical opportunity that the moment of change creates, was capable of. The moon presence did not account for trick weapons. Gehrman would have found this funny if he had known, if there had been a version of the events where he could have seen it from the outside. The craftsman's philosophy embedded in a weapon, embedded in the hands of a hunter who used it against the entity that built the prison the craftsman had spent centuries in. He would have found that funny in the quiet, private way of a person who does not often laugh, but recognizes when they encounter it a perfect irony. The click, the unfold, the shift from one configuration to another, faster than the opponent can respond to the change. That was always the point. Pull back, step away from the specific events, the workshop, the weapons, the dream, Maria, the fishing hamlet, the moon presence, the three endings. Step back far enough that you can see the shape of the whole thing at once, the full arc of a life that extended across a span of time that no human life is supposed to extend across, and try to see what it was about. Gehrman was about craft, not as a theme or a symbol or a metaphor for something else, as the literal, central, organizing fact of his existence. His relationship to the making of things was the relationship that everything else in his life existed in relation to. His philosophy came from it. His teaching came from it. His love for Maria was expressed through it. The doll, the weapons, the specific quality of his attention when he was working in the same space as someone he cared about. His response to loss was always to reach for the tools and make something that held the shape of what was lost. His relationship to the dream was a craftsman's relationship. He took the space he'd been given and organized it the way he organized his workshop, with the practical intentionality of a person who makes spaces work. And his deepest gift to the hunters who came through the dream was a craftsman's gift. Not the weapons, though the weapons were extraordinary. The understanding of what the weapons expressed, the philosophy of adaptation, of the value of transformation, of the tactical opportunity that the moment of change creates. Every hunter who learned this from Gehrman, who understood not just how to use the trick weapon, but what the trick weapon was saying about how to survive, carried something more durable than the weapon itself. They carried the insight that the weapon encoded. This is what masters do. This is the highest achievement of the craftsman's tradition that Gehrman represented. Not the making of beautiful things, though the things were beautiful, but the transmission of the understanding that made beautiful things possible. The giving of the principle rather than just the product. The teaching that survives the teacher, that continues to produce hunters and weapons and ways of thinking about the hunt long after the specific workshop in the specific city has been buried under the ash of everything that came after. He also was about love. This is the thing the doll makes visible, the thing that the moon presence found and used and, in the specific alchemy of the dream's construction, transformed into something it did not entirely intend. The plain doll is Gehrman's love, animated by cosmic agency into something that is now its own real thing. She cares for the hunters who pass through the dream with a warmth that is entirely genuine, that does not come from Gehrman directly, and does not come from the moon presence, and comes, somehow, from the combination of Gehrman's grief and the moon presence's power and the specific shape of what he had built in the old abandoned workshop because he could not bear the absence of the person it was built to resemble. Love produces things. Gehrman's love for Maria produced the doll. The doll produced the care that held the dream's hunters through their worst nights. That care made it possible for hunters to keep going, to come back, to try again, to eventually become the thing that the dream was pointing toward. The love is not a sentimental footnote to the story. It is structurally necessary. Without it, the dream does not function the way the dream needs to function. The craftsman's grief was not incidental to the cosmic project. It was essential to it. Gehrman did not know this. He did not build the doll as a contribution to a cosmic project. He built the doll because he was a craftsman, and the craftsman's response to loss is to make something. He did not love Maria strategically. He loved her the way people love things, helplessly, with more investment than is ever safe, in the specific way that a person discovers they love something, precisely at the moment they are in danger of losing it, or have already lost it. This is Gehrman, a craftsman who loved his craft and the people who used what it produced, who lost the person he loved most and made a likeness of her, because it was all he could do, who said yes to a bargain in the dark because the bargain offered purpose and a version of the person he had lost, and he was not strong enough in that moment of grief and loss to say no to either, who spent centuries in the dream caring about hunters he could not follow, tending a garden he had not chosen, waiting for the ending that the dream would not allow, until finally, one night, a hunter arrived who could provide it. He was not a hero in the conventional sense. He did not slay the greatest monsters or discover the deepest truths or sacrifice himself in the dramatic moment that redeems a life of compromises. He was something quieter and more durable than that. He was the craftsman at the centre of things, making what could be made, caring with what he had left, waiting with the patience of a person who has no other option but who has decided, in the absence of options, that waiting with full presence is better than waiting with none. The hunt exists because of him. The weapons exist because of him. The philosophy that made it possible for hunters to do what hunters do in Bloodborne exists because of him. And the ending, whatever ending you reached, in whatever playthrough brought you to the garden in the moonlight at the centre of the dream, exists because he built what was needed to make it possible, and then stayed in the dream long enough for you to arrive and use it. The craftsman at the centre of everything, making and teaching and loving and losing and making again, until the night finally ended. Let the story settle now. Let it move through you the way stories move through a person who is almost asleep. Not as information, not as a sequence of events to be memorized and catalogued, but as something felt. As the particular emotional texture of a long life carried to its conclusion, a person finally allowed to put down what they have been carrying. The garden is empty in the morning, or it will be in whichever ending brought us here. The flowers Gehrman tended are still there. Flowers do not immediately know when their gardener is gone. The moon that was always slightly wrong, slightly too large and too pale and too present for a moon in an ordinary sky, is going down or has gone down or was never a moon at all but something that wore the moon's appearance. The workshop is quiet. The weapons are still on the shelves. The doll is still in the garden. If you saw the second ending, you are in the chair now. You are what the dream needs, and she is what she was, and the garden goes on. If you saw the third ending, you are somewhere else entirely, and she is in the garden with the infant that you became, and whatever tenderness she feels for it is the real tenderness. The genuine care that was animated into her by the combination of a craftsman's grief and a cosmic entity's power, and the specific miracle of something made from love becoming something that can feel and express its own. Think about the old abandoned workshop, the small room at the bottom of the shaft in the cathedral ward where most players never go, the broken doll in the corner, the cold fireplace, the lamp that does not work. This is where all of it started. Not in Byrgenwerth, not in the healing church, not in the cosmic geography of the nightmare or the Great One's native reality. Here, in a small room, with a grieving craftsman and the thing he made because he did not know what else to do. Everything that the night contained, the weapons and the hunt and the dream and the guidance and the centuries of care and the endings, all of it grew from that room, from the grief that the craftsman carried there, from the hands that reached for the tools because the hands did not know how else to respond to the fact of someone being gone. This is what Gehrman taught, without teaching it, across the full length of his impossible story, that the response to loss is making, that the craftsman who has lost the thing they made their craft in service of does not stop, cannot stop, not the good ones, not the ones for whom the making was never purely instrumental but was always also the point. He could not keep Maria. He made the doll. He could not keep the workshop centrality. He kept the workshop. He could not keep the free, purposeful life of a craftsman in the world. He kept the craft in the dream. He could not stop the hunt from becoming something the healing church controlled. He kept making weapons that said what he believed about what the hunt was supposed to be. All of it was the same response, made in different forms to different losses. I cannot keep the thing itself. I will make the thing that holds the shape of what was lost. I will keep making, because making is the only response I know that does not abandon the thing that the loss was a loss of. He made things all his life, right up until the end, in the only forms available, with the only materials he had, for the only people he could reach, and the things he made, the weapons and the workshop and the doll and the dream itself and the guidance he gave and the care he offered and the philosophy he encoded in every trick weapon that clicked and unfolded in the hands of every hunter who ever came through his door, lasted. They lasted past him. They lasted into the night you played, into the hands you carried them in, into the engagement you survived because a craftsman who has been dead for centuries built the weapon correctly, and the weapon worked the way he designed it to work, and you came home. He built things that lasted. In the end, that is what he was, a craftsman who built things that lasted. A person who made what was needed and gave it honestly and cared about whether it worked, and kept caring even when caring cost more than it gave back. Good night, good hunter. Rest now. The night is long, but the telling of it is longer, and you have been patient with both. Let the words go quiet. Let the garden settle. Let the craftsman rest. He has earned it. He has more than earned it. Sleep well. Thank you for spending this time with Nightfall lore. 5,000 of you, and every single one matters more than I know how to say. If Gehrman's story carried you somewhere tonight, leave a like and let me know in the comments what part stayed with you. The next story is already waiting. Until then, good night, good hunter.